administering the final. And as I said, if we can design the final intelligently, it ought to be fun, and you should enjoy it, assuming you're ready for it. Now, the way I did it last year, and it seemed to work out pretty well, was to divide the exam into 4 different sections. And each section, you answer 2 questions, which gives you a total of 8 answers. The 4 questions were the 4 sections were one section on speech act theory, which is sort of how we began the course. The second set of questions were on mainstream philosophy of language, which is to say essentially reference and meaning. And then I went on to some more controversial case of that in the third section on internalism, externalism, and truth. Now, of course, you'll see there's some overlap here. You don't get a sharp distinction between reference and meaning and internalism and externalism, because internalism and externalism are precisely theories about reference and meaning. But still, the way that I organized the actual presentation of the lectures, it seems useful to distinguish those 2 parts of the final. And then section 4, applications of the theory to problems like metaphor, fiction, indirect speech acts, and pictures. So just to, so you have it, the first is about speech acts. The second is reference and meaning. And the third was externalism and truth. And then the fourth was applications. And of course, the area of application varies enormously, all the way from fictional utterances to pictorial representation. Now, there is something that I discussed, but probably which may not come up on the final, but it's worth emphasizing, and that is it's usually neglected in course in the philosophy of language, but I think it's absolutely crucial. Language isn't just another social institution, something that we use because it's more convenient to communicate information with language than it is by other means. The idea being that until we invent telepathy, we'll have to sort of struggle along with these messy, sweaty languages. But there is a very important sense in which language is the fundamental social institution. All other social institutions are dependent on language. Money, property, government, marriage, universities, lawyers, doctors, cocktail parties, and summer vacations all require language. Why? Well, those entities only exist as such if they are represented as existing. So, for example, something is money or a piece of private property or a university or a government only if people think about it and talk about it in a certain way. But now, how do they do that? I mean, I like to take the example of money because it's an obvious case. But what fact about these bits of paper make them into money? I seem to be running short, but here's one. And the fact is not a fact about the physics and chemistry. Now, that's an amazing phenomenon. We ought to think about it because, of course, we think ultimately everything reduces to molecules, atoms, and subatomic particles. And yet, even if with the best microscope, if you look at this and look at the subatomic particles, you won't discover that it's a $20 bill. That is, the fact that it's money is not a fact like the fact about the chemical bond, valences, force, mass, or gravitational attraction. Why not? What the hell is going on? Now again, remember, as I've told you before, in philosophy you got to start by being astounded by what any sane person just takes for granted. And I think most sane people just take money, property, and marriage for granted, though the details of marriage are constantly being debated. But as philosophers, we don't take them for granted. We're puzzled how such things can exist. And the short answer is that they can exist only if they're represented as existing. You have to think of them and talk about them in a certain way. And how is that possible? Well, you have to have language for that sort of thought and talk. You have to have some way of representing the fact that this is money. And to do that, you have to have some means of representing. You have to have a certain kind of vocabulary. Now, that's an amazing fact if you think about it, because what we're saying is that money, property, government, and marriage aren't just describable by language, but they're created. They're created by linguistic representations that have a certain logical form, and you know what that logical form is. It's that of the declaration. That is, in the case of money, we make the stuff money by representing it as being money, and thus we achieve the word-to-word direction of fit. We change this piece of paper into money, but of course we do that only by representing it as money. The fact that it's money can only exist if it's represented as money, but representing it in that way makes it the case that it's money. Now that is an amazing fact about human languages, and other forms of animal communication known to me have nothing like that. I mean, the bees are absolutely wonderful with their ability to communicate all kinds of stuff, but the bees don't have governments and private property and marriage and divorce, and they don't have legal disputes over their rate of taxation or anything like that. Why not? Well, they got other things to worry about, but their language is not rich enough to enable them to create a reality by representing that reality as existing. Now this, incidentally, is the foundation of the social sciences, and it's going to take a while before they recognize this. But I've written a couple books about this. One is called The Construction of Social Reality, and then I got some new ideas and had to think of another title that meant the same but sounded different because it's the same subject. So the second book is called Making the Social World. But they both are different aspects of the same subject matter. And it worked out pretty well. Nobody confuses the second title with the first. So The Construction of Social Reality and Making the Social World is the most recent one. There's a hostile and extremely stupid review of Making the Social World in one of the latest issues of the New York Review of Books. But don't hold your breath, because I'm going to reply to that review. I wrote a reply, and they said it's too damn long. Well, it was kind of long, I admit. So now I'm busy trying to cut it down to some, I won't say respectable limit. I mean, it's pretty naked as it is, but I hope they'll print the cut-down version. In any case, I'm going to put a longer version on my website. The interesting thing is the form that the guy takes who attacks me is he says, well, you don't need language to have money, property, government, and marriage. You just have to think in concepts. Yeah, but how do you think in concepts? Well, the answer, of course, for these kind of concepts, you have to have some vehicle. The picture he has is you just have concepts going through your brain. But of course, the concepts going through your brain have to have some kind of vehicle. You can't just think in pure concepts. Try it out. Take any thought. Obama's problems with the taxation, with the extension of the tax cuts, will run into serious trouble because there seems to be a dispute between both his own Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and neither seems to be entirely in agreement with him. Okay, now that's a thought I just invented on the spot, having heard somebody say something like that on the car radios I was coming here. Now think that thought in words. Now think the same thought with no words at all. And I find I can't do it. You've got to have some means to think with. Not all thinking occurs in words. When I'm skiing fast down a mountain, I don't have time to think things like, turn left or you'll run into the damn tree. I might say that afterwards after I run into the tree. But I just respond to the environment. But when you're thinking about something abstract, like taxation and government, you have to have some means of thinking that, and so there's no separation between thought and language. Thought of this kind can only occur in language. Anyway, what I'm suggesting is now that there's ways of looking beyond the material of the course, and the material in this course is actually the foundation for the nature of social reality, the nature of social ontology. Okay, so that's looking beyond. Now let's look back and think how the material we actually covered. The first part of the course concerned the theory of speech acts. Well, maybe we should stop for questions. I've said a lot about the exam and how it's going to be organized or how it's likely to be organized, and how the material that we've covered has implications beyond what I've been able to specify. But let's take questions. You had a hand up. Yeah. Yeah, well, it is one of the miraculous facts that Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf, managed to learn as much as she did. And it is an amazing feat. And I think one of the secrets is that she was both intelligent and she had a lot of time. She had a lot of time on her hands. You know, she didn't have to worry about giving her Tuesday lecture or anything like that. And so she managed to focus. But it is an interesting question, how the different ways in which people can acquire language and symbolism. Now, I told you the unfortunate story of a girl in Los Angeles who was kept in a closet and never really learned language. She did learn some, but then her parents got her back, and apparently she lost the little bit of language that she had before. But it's clear that you can learn language without without being able to hear, without hearing a spoken language. And one of the fascinating forms of languages are the sign languages. American Sign Language is very well developed. And I have had a series of lectures, I don't think in this particular course, but I've had a series of lectures where they had somebody over at the side of the room who would do the sign language as I was speaking. It seemed kind of miraculous to me, and I never really believed it, that they were saying in sign language all the things that I was saying. However, it's an interesting question. Why don't you work on it? That is, and let me know, what are the interesting similarities and differences between sign languages and spoken languages, and what are the expressive powers of sign language? Do they actually equal the expressive powers of spoken language? They do get a lot done. There's no question that deaf people are able to communicate remarkably effectively. So you don't have to talk, so to speak, in order to perform speech acts. Speech acts is a general term, and it doesn't imply just what comes out of your mouth, but what comes out of your finger movements or what marks you make on a blackboard or a sheet of paper. However, the basic question in the theory of speech acts is, I think, the basic question in the philosophy of language, and that is, how is it possible that we get from these noises that people make out of their mouths to human linguistic behavior, to speech acts, to statements, questions, assertions, commands, and all the rest of it? Now, what your question reminds us of is that that's not the only way to put the question. The question could be equally put about gestures or about marks on paper or any other means that people have of communicating. And in the most general form, the question is, how do you get from the physics to the semantics? There has to be some vehicle by which people can communicate with each other. For us, primarily, it is noises made through the mouth. But what your question reminds us is, it doesn't have to be. You can do it with signs, or you can do it with marks, or no doubt other means of communication. Okay, other questions about what I said so far? Yeah?
I was just going to say, since internalism and externalism is such a big part of the exam, would you mind going over
Yeah, okay. Now, that's the way I'd like to organize this. This lecture is not a formal lecture, so I'd rather if you guys just ask me questions about what bothers you. Here is the dispute between internalism and externalism. Internalism is the view that the resources of individuals in their brains are sufficient to relate language to reality. Now, sometimes, of course, they have to respond to other individuals, but the other individuals can only use what they have in their brains. So you have in a conversation, in order to understand the conversation, a guy has got to know only what's going on in his head, but also what's going on in her head. But the resources of the conversation have got to be in the heads of all the participants. Now, that is the traditional view It is represented very prominently today by Chomsky. Chomsky thinks you can't do linguistics except on the assumption of internalism, except on the assumption that the mode of existence of language is always in individual heads. Okay, now that is the view that is also implicit in Frege. And Frege, as you know, really began the contemporary subject of the philosophy of language, so that that particular aspect of Frege continues right down through Russell, Strawson, Austin, Grice, myself, and no doubt other people. Now that might seem a bit puzzling to say that Frege is an internalist, because he's very anxious to insist that language has to have a kind of external existence or we couldn't communicate with each other. There has to be a kind of objectivity to meanings, or we couldn't actually communicate in a public language. We'd all be talking just about our own private experiences. But all the same, that's still a kind of internalism, because it's only because we grasp these public meanings that we're able to communicate with them. It is our internal grasping of the public meanings or senses that enable us to communicate. Okay, now this was the happy form of the philosophy of language. It's internalism was what I brought up on, and in fact it was so commonly accepted that it was never even discussed. Nobody thought there was any other possibility except internalism. Now, in the 1970s, all hell broke loose, and there were a whole lot of attacks on internalism. And I will mention the ones of these that we've talked most about in lecture. The single most famous attack on internalism was, I think this is probably right, but you could argue it, but I think the single most famous attack on internalism was Hilary Putnam's famous twin earth argument. And you know how the argument goes. We imagine that there is, in a distant galaxy outside our light cone, a world, a solar system exactly like our solar system, and a little planet in that solar system called twin Earth, and everything on twin Earth is exactly the way it is on Earth. And everything is, as Putnam says, molecule for molecule identical with the way things are on Earth, with one exception. The stuff that they call water on twin Earth is not H2O, but is an extremely complicated chemical compound that it's now become traditional in philosophy to abbreviate as XYZ. So XYZ is not the same as H2O, but H2O and XYZ are both called, quote, water, unquote. But, says Putnam, in 1750, before anybody on either Earth or twin Earth knew any chemistry, when they said their word water, they didn't mean what we mean by water, because they meant XYZ and not H2O. We mean H2O and not XYZ. But since what is in the head is identical on both Earth and twin Earth, and what meanings are supposed to do is relate language to reality, and their language in the head relates differently to reality than ours, then what they mean cannot be the same as what we mean. And, says Putnam, what this shows is meanings ain't in the head. Meanings are not psychological entities in the head. Well, what are they? Well, they are external to the head, and they involve causal relations between the object referred to and the contents of the head that enable you to make reference using the corresponding words. So, meaning now is a matter of external causal relations, and the argument that's supposed to be decisive is that the external causal relations are necessary to explain meaning, because the contents of the head are insufficient to explain the phenomenon of meaning. And you can put this point very succinctly. All these arguments have the same structure. What's in the head can be identical for two different speakers, or the same speaker in two contexts, and yet the meaning is different. Now, if the meaning is different, then what's in the head cannot be sufficient for meaning, because what's in the head is the same on the two occasions. Mike Riepel put this well when he said, if you accept the supervenience conception of mental states, that mental states are supervenient on brain states, any different mental states require different brain states, then two people in exactly the same brain state, and that's the whole point about Earth and Twin Earth, two people in exactly the same brain state mean something different in two different cases. Okay, so that's the most famous argument. Now there are variants on that argument, and a variant on that argument was presented by Tyler Burge. Putnam took away meanings and said they're not in the head, but they're really partly in the world. There are causal relations between objects in the world and what's in the head, and meanings are matters of those causal relations. Somebody baptized this stuff as water, and then there's a causal relation between that baptism and what's in the head of the baptizers, and then that is transferred by a set of causal relations, a causal chain down to us. So we now use the word water to refer to the same liquid as the people who originally baptized something as water. Okay, but Putnam says meanings are not in the head. Now Burge goes to the next stage and says beliefs are not in the head. It's bad enough you lost meaning, but Burge is going to take beliefs away from you. And here's his argument. Imagine that there is a jogger in Santa Monica, and he gets a sore in his thigh from too much jogging. So he goes to his doctor, and he says, "Doctor, I got a pain in my thigh. I think it is arthritis." Okay, now the doctor, being a competent doctor, trained at one of the famous California medical schools, says to him, if it's a pain in your thigh, it can't be arthritis, because arthritis is an inflammation of the joint. If the doctor is then a tedious pedant with some classical education, he will go on to explain how itis means inflammation, and arthur has to do with joint, and the combination of arthritis means inflammation of the joint. Okay, now that's one scenario. The doctor says it can't be arthritis if it's a pain in your thigh, because arthritis is an inflammation of the joint. Okay, now hold the guy constant, but shift the context. The guy is no longer in actual Santa Monica, but he's in twin Santa Monica. And twin Santa Monica is just like Santa Monica, except they use the word arthritis differently. In twin Santa Monica, they use the word arthritis to refer to muscle pains as well as inflammations of the joint. So the doctor in twin Santa Monica says to the guy, yes, I guess you do have arthritis in the thigh. We've been getting a lot of arthritis cases from too much jogging going on. It's the damn beach in Santa Monica. You run on that sand, you're going to get a sore thigh. Okay, so now watch what happens in this case. In this case, we would say that the belief is different in the second case from what it was in the first case, because the second belief is true and the first belief was false. The guy believed, I have arthritis, but that's a false belief. But now the guy in the second case believes, I have arthritis, that's how he puts it, but that belief is true. But now you don't have to worry about, well, is it a twin earth case, because it's the same guy. That is, we're not imagining two different guys, but one and the same person in two different contexts. In one context, that guy holds the false belief, I have arthritis. And in the second case, he holds the true belief. Now I'm speaking English, I can't say he holds a true belief that he has arthritis because he doesn't have arthritis, as we use the word. So we'll invent a new word, arthritis. This is how the philosophy literature goes. You look up arthritis and you'll probably find a whole lot of references to it because this has become standard now. All right, so now in the second case, the guy truly believes that he has arthritis, and he uses the same words to express that belief, and now this is supposed to be the punchline. This is the decisive line. They can't be the same belief because one's true and the other's false. And indeed, the guy, there isn't any question about having two different guys with indistinguishable brain states, the same guy with the same brain state, and in one context he holds a false belief, and in the other context he holds a true belief. Now, when I tell you this stuff, I feel like I'm trying to give you the ontological proof of the existence of God. I think these are terrible arguments, but it's a fact about the profession that they're widely accepted, and I am regarded as in a minority in thinking they're terrible arguments. But let me tell you why they're terrible, but first you're going to say something. Yeah?
Well, I was trying to apply this to something that's maybe like slightly more realistic. Like in some languages, you have one color, one word for both blue and green.
Yeah.
So if I'm here in Berkeley and I say the ocean and the grass are the same color, but one's blue and one's green, that's false. But if I go to somewhere in Micronesia and I say it, then that's true. I mean, is that...
No, I think that's a good example, and it's a real-life example. I mean, because there are things like that. What constitutes same color? If you were a fashion designer in Paris or Milan, and you had a whole huge vocabulary, and you would say, well, the ocean is not at all the same color. Even this, let's put it this way, this color grass isn't the same color as the grass in the next yard, because one color is grass green and the other is turquoise green. So that's a different issue. That is the issue of how you identify same phi. You identify same phi relative to vocabulary for identifying phis.
This isn't relative to vocabulary, then. This is...
No, this is supposed to be a very deep philosophical point, and the point is as follows. The resources of the individual brain, and even the resources of the collection of individual brains, are never sufficient to account for semantics, because the resources in the brain can be the same, and yet the semantics is different. In the Putnam twin earth case, in the one case, they're referring to XYZ, and in the other case, they're referring to H2O, and hence they mean something different. But in both cases, what's in the brain is exactly the same. We postulate that it's the same. Burge's example is even simpler. Burge's example is, of course, what's in the brain is the same because it's the same guy at exactly the same time. He just happens to be in two different contexts. And in one context, he has a false belief. In real Santa Monica, he has a false belief, I have arthritis. In twin Santa Monica, he has a true belief, which we, reporting it, can say he truly believes that he has arthritis. The conclusion that Burge draws is, it's not up to you and what's in your head to decide what you believe. It's up to your community. And in one case, the community makes it clear that you have one belief, and the other case, it makes it clear that you have another belief. But in both cases, what's in your head is the same, so the belief is not uniquely determined by what's in your head. Do you understand? Everybody, you follow that now. Okay, now I think these are bad arguments, but let's make, anybody have any more questions before I launch an attack on these? Let's take Burge's first, because I think it is, I think it's easier to see what's going on. What exactly is the content of the guy's mind? In the content of the guy's mind is an actual sensation in his thigh. I've got this actual sensation here. I got this pain in my thigh. When he tells the doctor, I have a sensation, I think it is arthritis, or I believe it is arthritis. He, as we all do, attempts to use language in a way that matches his community. So it's implicit in his saying that he believes that the sensation in his thigh is called arthritis. He has a belief about the use of words in his community. But he doesn't actually believe that he has arthritis as standardly defined because he doesn't know the standard definition. His mistake is a mistake about the use of language, and you can see that by seeing that the content of his mind doesn't change when he discovers that it's not called arthritis. It's still exactly the same sensation. The only content is, what is it called? It's a semantic belief. It's a meta-linguistic belief about how words are used. So in that case, in both cases, they have the same belief to the effect, in both cases, the same guy with the same belief to the effect of a certain kind of sensation in his thigh. In one case, he believes truly that the sensation in his community is called arthritis. In the initial case, in the real community, he believes falsely that the sensation is called arthritis. So it's not a case of a different beliefs. It's exactly the same belief in the two cases, but it's true relative to one community that this is called arthritis, and false relative to another community that is called arthritis. So I don't think this is a threat to externalism at all. Now, when I presented this argument to Burge, he said, well, it's my damn example. I can do what I want with it, and I'm just going to postulate that the guy has no meta-linguistic beliefs. He's not going around, he's not a philosopher going around thinking, how is the word used in my community? And that seems fair enough to say that, but that won't do as an answer to the objection as I put it, because though I put it as a claim about his beliefs, in fact, when we use language, we take it for granted. It's part of our background presuppositions that our use of the vocabulary matches the linguistic practices of our community. And when we discover a difference, we will change. We have to communicate in a public language, so we will change our use of the vocabulary to match the community. So Burge can postulate that the guy doesn't consciously think, I have a belief about the use of the word arthritis in my community. But he cannot postulate that the guy doesn't have a taken for granted background presupposition. My use of language has to match the community, otherwise I won't succeed in communicating. That, I think, is a case of a background communication that we all have to have. And I gave you a kind of extreme example of this. See, what I'm saying is the guy in the first case doesn't really believe he has arthritis because he doesn't know what arthritis means. In the first case, he believes he has a pain and he believes it's called arthritis, and that's false. He believes it's called arthritis in his community. But it doesn't show that meanings are not in the head to show that he has a false belief about his community. Now, I gave you a kind of ridiculous example of that from my own idiotic semantic experiences. When I was a little kid, I loved new words, and I used to go around using new words without really the faintest idea what they meant. And I heard a new word, pregnant, and it seemed to apply to females more than to guys, especially if they were too fat. It applied to them. So I said in the presence of Sally's parents, I was about 8, she was about 11, I said in front of her parents, I think Sally's pregnant. And this created some consternation, and I later found out, no, that was not a correct use of the words. Now, did I, in fact, hold the belief that Sally was pregnant? No. I hadn't the faintest idea what the word meant. It sounded like a nice word, and I noticed she was getting fat. So I misused the word. But that is not a case where I had a false belief about Sally's pregnancy. I used those words, but I really didn't understand what they meant. Now, imagine a case where a guy really would have a false belief. I am the world's leading arthritis expert, and I think I've made a great discovery, a discovery that'll get me the Nobel Prize in medicine. Arthritis can exist in muscles. It is, since time immemorial, people have believed arthritis was only in joints, but I have made a great scientific discovery. Arthritis can exist in muscles. So I announce that, yes, I have arthritis right here in my thigh. Later on, it's proved that I was mistaken. Now, that's a case of a guy who actually holds a false belief to the effect that he has arthritis in his thigh. But that's a guy who's completely conversant with the linguistic usages of his community. Okay, now I want you to notice something else. In the Putnam examples, in the water on Earth and water on twin Earth, there is an indexical component. So if you look at the basic argument for externalism, the argument is always the same. It is that what's in the head is insufficient to account for meaning, because what's in the head can be the same and the meaning different, and the proof is that the reference is different. Okay, now I want to say all of the examples that make this seem plausible are always indexical. In fact, you needn't have constructed these twin Earth cases. Take on our Earth, where you have two identical twins, and each of them says, I am hungry. And we'll suppose, for the sake of argument, that they're identical down to the last molecule in their brains. That's science fiction, of course, but why not? We'll suppose that they are identical down to the last molecule in their brains. Each of them says, I am hungry, but all the same, they mean something different. John means that John is hungry, and Bill means that Bill is hungry. Why? Well, because I, though it keeps a constant meaning, is an indexical expression. And you know how indexical expressions work. Indexical expressions work because their mode of presentation, to use the Frege jargon, that is, the way they fix reference, is relative to the very utterance itself. They are self-referential, or as I now prefer to say, they're self-reflexive to the utterance itself. So the one guy says, I am hungry, and that is the truth condition of that are relative to his very utterance of the word I. I refers to the guy who's uttering it. Same word, same meaning, different utterers, hence different references, because the references are indexical. So Putnam's argument about twin Earth just shows that there is an indexical component in the definition of words like water, and I think that is a valuable contribution. What the indexical component is this. We're going to let the word water mean anything identical in structure, that is, anything that bears the relation same liquid to the stuff that we have identified as water. All this talk about water is making me thirsty. I hope I brought my thermos. Ha! To the rescue. Okay, I'll get out some twin Earth water here. What Putnam succeeds in showing is that water is defined as anything that has the same structure as this liquid. That's an indexical component, but then the identification is self-reflexive to the very indexical presentation of the object in question. So the fact that identical brain structures can produce different references in cases where the reference is indexical does not show that meanings are not in the head. On the contrary, you only understand the indexical if you understand it as indexical to the very resources that the agent is using, namely his utterance, or in his thought, if he's thinking, his thinking that very utterance, I am hungry, he thinks it in his head. So the identification is always relative to his cognitive resources because it's indexical. Indexicality as such is not a threat to internalism. Now, let's get to another version of this same. Another argument for externalism was given by John Perry. And Perry argues two theses. One, some indexicals are essential. That is, his original article was called The Essential Indexical. And he correctly points out that there are certain indexical expressions that you can't eliminate. You can't, if you remember the supermarket scene, the guy spilling sugar, and it's not enough for him to say someone is spilling sugar in the Shattuck Avenue on Andronikos, because what he discovers as he tries to follow it around the supermarket is it's coming out of his very cart. So the belief someone is spilling sugar is a different belief from I am spilling sugar. Indeed, the belief that I am spilling sugar is a different belief for him than the belief that John Perry is spilling sugar, because he might not know that he is John Perry. So the indexical there is indexical and is eliminable. You can't get rid of it. It's essential to understanding his utterance and his belief that it should contain an indexical. Okay, that's Perry's first point. Now his second point is, in the case of indexicals, there is no completing Phrygian sense. That is to say, the sense of I when I say it and the sense of I when you say it is exactly the same. So on Frege's account that sense determines reference, there isn't any sense here that is sufficient to determine reference, because we have the same Phrygian sense and different references. Okay, so there are 2 points to Perry's argument. One, the essential indexical. And Kaplan gives a good example of that. Kaplan says, I see a guy in the window, and I think that guy's pants are on fire. Oh my God, I should get some water and help him put them out. But then I discover it's not a window, it's a mirror, and my pants are on fire. My belief is different, even though my perception is the same. That is an essential indexical. Okay, but so I agree with that that indexicals are essential to the proposition being conveyed. But I disagree with the second point. The second point, there's no completing Phrygian sense, because the resources of language and the mind are insufficient by themselves to fix reference. Reference has to be fixed by something external, like causal relations or something like that. Now, what I'm arguing, and what I've argued in our account of indexicals, in the account of indexicals I gave you, is no, there is a completing Phrygian sense. The completing Phrygian sense is self-reflexive to the utterance of the expression itself. So the utterance of I in I am hungry, or I am thirsty, or I am spilling sugar is self-reflexive to that very utterance. It refers to the person making that utterance, and that gives it a completing Phrygian sense. So he's wrong to say that the mode of presentation doesn't identify a single object uniquely. Oh, it does. It identifies it relative to the utterance of the expression itself. And by the way, I think Perry agrees with me about that. I've discussed it with, I don't want to quote him when he's not here, but I've disagreed with him. It's amazing how much of this stuff goes on in California. So Burge is at UCLA and Perry is at Stanford. Fortunately, I think externalism didn't rear its head in Berkeley as much as it did in these other places, but I may be being overly optimistic about that. Okay, so let me tell you what these guys did establish, and I think they're right about that. Putnam was confronted with the traditional view that goes back to Aristotle, that the meaning of a word is given by a checklist of general terms. What does the word water mean? It means a clear, colorless, tasteless liquid that falls out of the sky in the form of rain and flows in streams and rivers and is in lakes and oceans. That would be a sort of checklist. And then if we're doing it Aristotle-wise, we'd identify the genus would be liquid, and the species would be having these clear, colorless features. Now, Putnam sees that's really a hopeless definition. To begin with, water isn't tasteless. Tastes like water. If it tasted like scotch or gasoline, you'd get an entirely different reaction when I had a drink of it. So water isn't tasteless, it tastes like water, and it isn't really colorless. It looks like water. If it were really colorless, it would be totally invisible for reasons you learned in high school. Remember about the reflection of light waves and your ability to see something. So it's kind of, and if you ask me, well, what color was the liquid? And I say, well, it's kind of water-colored, really. Okay, that's a color too. So the checklist is wrong, and I think Putnam is right to see that the checklist conception, it's amazing how, what a prodigious history the checklist has. It goes back to Aristotle. And I think the answer is, the reason it's so appealing is you can make dictionaries. You can't, hard to use indexicals in a dictionary. Hard to say in the dictionary, look under water. Water is this stuff. Well, that's no good to you if you're just reading a dictionary. So I think Putnam is right about that. Now also, these guys are right about an important aspect of indexicals, and I didn't sufficiently emphasize that in the course of the semester, and so let me emphasize it now. Frege left us with a deep mistake. The mistake is to suppose that the mode of presentation, the sense, is always part of propositional content. So the propositional content of I am hungry does not contain the mode of presentation. It just identifies a particular object. Now, Kaplan gives a very elegant proof of that, and it's this. If you take the sentence, I am here now, that sentence uttered by me, I am here now, it can hardly be false, right? Because it means the person making this utterance is present at the place of the utterance at the time of the utterance. And that looks like it's pretty close to being analytically true. But of course, the fact that I am here now, that's a contingent fact. That's not a necessary truth. So it looks like you have to separate the fact reported, which is a contingent truth, from the mode of presentation, which is always going to come out true. It's always true that the guy making the utterance is present at the time of the utterance and the place of the utterance. Now there's a wonderful thing that is cropping up in ordinary discourse. It drives me crazy, but it makes a good exam question. You call somebody up and the answering machine says, I am not here now. Now what's that supposed to mean? They weren't there when they recorded the message? Well, of course they were. What they're doing is shifting the time of utterance from the place and time of the origin of the utterance to the time of the reception of the utterance. So it's true that I am not here now, I say into my answering machine. When you hear it, when you hear the thing, when you're telephoning me. But in the normal application, we assume time and place of the production of the utterance and the reception of the utterance are the same in normal conversation. But this particular form of conversation, when the voice says, I am not here now, what they mean is they're not there at the time you are hearing the utterance, not that they weren't there at the time of the making of the utterance. Okay, so again, kind of long-winded answer, but let me go through, just summarize what I've said. There are a bunch of arguments for externalism and against internalism. They all have the same basic structure, namely the resources of the brain are not sufficient to account for reference, because the resources of the brain can be the same and reference and therefore meaning different. And there are we've considered three different kinds of these. They are the twin earth arguments, the arthritis argument, Burgess saying meaning is socially determined, it's not individually determined. And then there's the Perry-Kaplan argument about essential indexicals. And I've tried to answer each of those. Now, I have not gone into Kripke and the Kripke-Putnam account of rigid designators, and we should consider that next. Yes, say some more. Yeah, essential indexical means this. A proposition contains an indexical essentially if you could not express the same proposition without an indexical. And the idea is this. If I say my pants are on fire, you cannot express that proposition without using an indexical. You cannot say the Slusser professor of philosophy's pants are on fire, because I might not know that. I might be totally, I might say, oh, some damn fool professor, who cares about his pants? It's my pants that I'm worried about. Similar in Perry's case, I am spilling sugar in the supermarket. Everybody remembers how the example works. He's going around the supermarket and he sees there's a line of sugar on the floor. It's a good example. And he thinks, oh, I better catch up to the person who's spilling the sugar, because they're spilling the sugar all over the floor of the supermarket. And he runs around faster and faster and notices that the pile gets bigger, but he doesn't find the guy spilling. And finally it occurs to him, oh my gosh, I am the guy spilling the sugar. Now that's an essential indexical, because it won't. You can't say the same thing by saying John Perry is spilling sugar, because he knows I am spilling sugar, but might not know that he's John Perry. So the proposition expressed is essentially indexical. That's the point.
So the only reason you can't say John Perry is spilling sugar is because he might have like amnesia or something?
Well, he might not know. You see, it's the proposition John Perry is spilling sugar must be a different proposition from the proposition I am spilling sugar, because one could know one and not know the other. It isn't that we think amnesia is common among Stanford professors. No, we're not thinking that. But we just think it's just got to be a different proposition because of this possibility, the possibility that he might not know that he is John Perry. Okay, any other questions about that? Yeah. The I doesn't exist? Yeah. Well, there is that's a very deep philosophical question. Let me explain it to people in the back. If you ask, what is the I? Well, it looks like it's illegitimate for me to use I, because there isn't any such thing as the I. And I'm reluctant to bring this up because it's got an extremely long, sordid, and spectacular history. The standard author on this subject is Hume, and Hume says that there are many philosophers who think that they're all the time aware of themselves as a self or as a mental substance. And we know who he's talking about. He's talking about Descartes. And Descartes says, I have only got to turn my attention inwards, and I become aware of myself as a mental essence, as a being whose essence is thinking, by which he means any conscious state. And then you remember Descartes says, and furthermore, I have a proof that I am a thinking being, because I have a property that my body doesn't have. Namely, I can conceive of my body's non-existence. My body might, for all I know, be a hallucination now, but I can't conceive of my own non-existence. Therefore, I am not my body. What am I? I am a mental substance. Okay, that's Descartes' argument for the idea that the self is a mental substance and not a physical object. Now along comes Hume, and Hume says, oh yeah, and how do I find this I? I do the standard philosophical method. I clutch my forehead, concentrate, and where do I find the I? Well, what do I find? I find somebody's pushing his hand against my forehead, must be me. Oh yeah, there's a slight headache left over from the Cabernet. Well, maybe it wasn't the Cabernet, maybe it was the stuff afterwards, and so on. That is, what you find, says Hume, are a series of specific, particular experiences. You never find the self. All you can find are particular experiences. So we have this peculiar history. Descartes has a kind of bucket theory of the mind. Here's the bucket, and here are all the mental states. Now, says Descartes, I know that I must be identical with a bucket and not the body that the bucket is in, because I could still be me even if I didn't have a body. But Hume says, no bucket. There is no self. There are only particular experiences. And he has, that makes it look as if he maybe didn't look close enough, but he in fact has a picture Suppose somebody says, oh, I do have a self. It's a particular kind of yellow blotch. It's up there on the upper left side of my visual field. Well, says Hume, that would just be another marble in the bucket. So it isn't just that it doesn't happen to be a self, but there couldn't be a self because any experience you have would not be of a self, but would just be another experience, another content of your mind. So Descartes says the self is a kind of bucket in which the experiences as marbles are rolling around. Hume says there isn't any bucket, and if there were, it wouldn't be a bucket, it would just be another marble, because anything you can experience is a bucket. Okay, what's the solution to this problem? Well, if this were a course in the philosophy of mind, I'd have lots more to say about it. Hume's solution is, well, we have the illusion that we're the same because these things kind of resemble each other. So one passes away and another one comes along, which looks like it. But now, to whom is this looking like going on, according to Hume? So I think Hume's account of perception is mistaken, that each perception is entirely separate from all others. I don't think you can make sense of the notion of perception on this atomistic marble conception that Hume has. And if we actually ask for the... by the way, some questions sound much better in German. If you say, what is the I, which was your question, that sounds, well, what the hell are you talking about? But was ist das Ich? That sounds like pretty heavy-duty German philosophy. And indeed, I think there are an awful lot of bad philosophy is based on that. I won't try to answer the question about the nature of the self because it's a complicated issue, and I discuss it in various books. You can look at a book I wrote called, what the hell is it called? Look at The Rediscovery of the Mind, and look at Mind, A Brief Introduction. But I think it's fair to predict that you will not get a question on the final exam of the form, was ist das Ich? Or even that question translated into English, French, or Italian. Oh, okay, any other questions at this stage? Well, yeah. Oh, yeah, Kripke. Okay. Well, all right. Now, Kripke has a conception about rigid designators, and I think he's right about, in general, right about that. That in the case of proper names, and he thinks general terms as well, the proper names in general function rigidly because for any proper name, a rigid designator is designed as an expression that refers to the same object in counterfactual situations, or as they like to put it nowadays, in all possible worlds. So if I say Benjamin Franklin is identical with the inventor of bifocals, well, the left-hand side, Benjamin Franklin, is a rigid designator. That refers to the same entity in all possible circumstances. But the inventor of bifocals is not a rigid designator. That could refer to different people in different circumstances because it's easy to imagine a world in which somebody else invented bifocals, in which Thomas Jefferson invented bifocals. So, says Kripke, proper names can't be identical in functioning to any definite descriptions because definite descriptions are not, in general, not rigid designators, and proper names are rigid designators. They refer to the same object in different counterfactual circumstances. Now, I think that, and then he substitutes a causal account of proper names. He says there's an initial baptism, and then the name is passed from speaker to speaker, and the only intentional content is that each speaker has to have the intention, I am referring to the same object as the person from whom I got this name. That's the only content, but that the actual, what secures reference is the continuity of the causal chain. So this is supposed to be an attack on the descriptivist conception of proper names. And there are two attacks. One is a semantic argument that says, indeed, any description that you might actually give, suppose by Socrates, you mean the guy who invented the invented the dialectic method in philosophy and was the teacher of Plato, who taught philosophy to Plato and lived in Athens. You give a bunch of descriptions. Well, says Kripke, it might turn out to be false that Socrates invented the dialectic method. It might turn out to be false that he was the teacher of Plato, but all the same, you're still referring to Socrates. So the descriptivist theory of names can't be right because the descriptions might be false and still you're referring to the same guy. And furthermore, any description that you would put would be a non-rigid designator, and proper names are rigid designators. Now, Kripke also says words like water are rigid designators because they refer to the same thing in all possible worlds. Now that gives him an interesting result that I think is mistaken, but again a lot of people accept it, and it is this. If you say water is identical with H2O, then, says Kripke, this proposition must be a necessary proposition, must be true in all possible worlds, because water is a rigid designator, refers to a certain kind of substance, and H2O is a rigid designator. And if they both are rigid, then if the statement, if it's true, must be necessarily true. But now we get an epistemically surprising result. This has to be discovered empirically. We made a factual empirical discovery. In the traditional jargon, we made an a posteriori discovery. After, that means after experience, an a posteriori discovery that water is H2O. But the discovery was a discovery of a necessary truth. Now that has become, I think, an awful lot of philosophers who ought to know better accept that. My own view is the following. What happens when you in our culture, when you define these general terms, is you leave open a gap for what is the underlying chemical compound. What's the underlying chemical structure that accounts for the compound? So what happens when we discover that water is H2O is not that we discover a metaphysically necessary truth. What we actually discover is a contingent fact that the cluster of features that we associate with water that are indexically defined in a way that I told you, water is anything identical with this stuff, that stuff is in fact made up of H2O molecules. Now, and this is the key point, once you make that discovery, you change the definition. Once we discover the essential underlying feature that makes something what it is, then you change the definition. And this is true generally in the sciences. If you define potassium in terms of its surface features, it's the stuff that melts at 34 degrees centigrade, and then later on you discover its chemical nature, you discover its atomic number, then you redefine it in terms of the underlying physics and chemistry. So I think what actually happened is when we made this discovery, we redefined water. It's now a definitional truth that water is H2O, and that is in fact, if you look in any definition in any dictionary, you'll find water under H2O. So I offer an alternative conception of proper names in the chapter. I think it's a chapter in the assigned reading called Our Meanings in the Head, where I attack all of these guys. And I say that in fact, if you have to distinguish between the names where we just I talk about people in our immediate environment, and names of historical figures, which the philosophers always like to fasten onto. And there, our use of the name is parasitic on other people's. It's dependent. So I hear a word, even about people in Berkeley, and I hear a name of somebody I don't know, and I then go on to use the name to refer to that person. And if you ask me, well, who are you talking about? I can say, well, I'm talking about the same person that she was talking about. That is, my reference here is parasitic on somebody else's. And I think the causal chain as described by Putnam and Kripke and so on, is just the parasitic cases described from the third-person point of view. It's a case where you get the reference from somebody else, and you then make a reference which is dependent on somebody else making a reference, somebody else's capacities. And this is true generally. It isn't just true of proper names. So if you think of words that you use all the time, in general, you couldn't, or I couldn't, define them. What's wrong with cigarettes? Well, they contain nicotine. What's nicotine? Well, I don't know. It's some kind of stuff in cigarettes, and it's bad for you. I can't give you a definition of nicotine. All I can give you is this sort of lame statement. Well, it's the stuff that's bad for you that occurs in cigarettes, and it's habit-forming. I might tell you a few other things. It causes cancer. But Putnam is right to say, my use here is dependent on there being experts, on there being people who actually can give you an account of the chemistry of nicotine. So we presuppose, we make uses of language that are dependent on there being a community about which where we can rely on there being in the community members that can actually give a more adequate account of the reference. And this happens all the time. If I say, this car still uses leaded gasoline, well, what exactly is the lead? I mean, they don't put chunks of lead in the gasoline. Again, I know what I'm talking about when I talk about leaded and unleaded gasoline, but not because I have a chemical definition, but just I go for the pump that says unleaded rather than the pump that says leaded. And this is common to all sorts of things. If somebody said, well, your computer needs a new motherboard. This has actually happened to me. What exactly is the motherboard? Well, it's not all that maternal. But all the same, when I go to the shop and I say my computer needs a new motherboard, and they say, yeah, it does, and then it turns out it costs a hell of a lot of money, but they put in a new motherboard. So there are all kinds of uses of language where our uses are parasitic or dependent on other people. Yeah, Mike?
So with, like, going back to the arthritis thing, I think
yeah.
part of Burke's idea is that the guy can have beliefs, like first-order beliefs involving the concept of arthritis, because one wouldn't want to claim that simply not knowing the precise definition of the word doesn't preclude from having these beliefs, and then going on it sort of extends to a lot.
Yes, okay, but now what exactly is the guy's belief? In the case, you see, in my case, I'm not totally confused about motherboards as I was totally confused about Sally's pregnancy. I think it's definitely a part of the computer, and it functions to get the other parts of the computer to function in a certain way with each other. And that enables me to have sort of true and false beliefs about motherboards. But in the guy in the arthritis case, the guy only, if you give a total exhaustive account of his beliefs, it comes out as, I have a belief that there's this unpleasant sensation in my thigh, there's a pain in my thigh, and I have a belief it's called arthritis. That's not enough for me to say, he really believes that it's arthritis. Yeah, say some more.
What about like with the nicotine, like, you know, it's some sort of thing, it's in cigarettes.
Yeah.
Maybe you believe there's something in your coffee too.
No, but I do have beliefs about nicotine, and if I falsely believe that this chalk contains nicotine, and so you mustn't eat it. That is a false belief, but I'm not totally bereft where nicotine is concerned. I know that it is a substance that it makes cigarettes and tobacco generally habit-forming. That there are efforts to make cigarettes that don't have nicotine. Yeah, say some more. Yeah.
So what about if you're like in Berkeley where nicotine applies to caffeine
and nicotine? Yeah.
Right, and then you say, oh, there's nicotine in coffee, and what you're saying is true.
Yeah.
As we use it, it's not true.
Yeah. Okay. What follows? See, what Burge wanted to get was not a case which was like your case, where the same word might be used, a wider and narrower extension. What he wanted was a case where the guy had the same thing in his head in two different communities, and in one case he had a false belief, and in the other case he had a true belief. And I have argued that that's a misdescription of the case as he has described it, because he doesn't hold the belief that he has arthritis in the first community. What he holds is the belief that he's got something that is called arthritis. Anyway, how much time have we?